Before the invention of the microscope, we had no idea that microorganisms that control so many things actually existed. So why is light any different at all? Today's guest is going to break down why some light waves that you may not be able to see are causing you more harm than the ones that you can see. So stay tuned. Welcome back, my friends. My name is Sarah. I am known as Carnivore Yogi. Thank you so much for being here and clicking on today's video. Today, we're gonna have another conversation about health as it relates to light waves that you cannot see, right? So as I mentioned in that intro, before the invention of the microscope, people thought that these microorganisms were non-existent, that people were crazy for talking about how they influenced our health and our behavior and our mood. However, now it's just common knowledge. So a lot of the things I talk about today with my guest are on that same wavelength, if you will. His name is Ian Mitchell. He is one of the world's top biochemists. It was an absolute pleasure to get to speak with him. He has been associated with and worked with some of the top names in the health and wellness industry, as well as NASA and Olympic athletes. So you are really going to enjoy this conversation. There are a ton of timestamps linked down there in the show notes because a lot of the conversation you may want to go back and listen to or pause. There's just a lot in this conversation for you as it relates to our health. So make sure you check that all out. We also talk about C60 and deuterium, which is a bit of a hot topic these days as well. So again, all of that can be found down in the show notes, those timestamps available to you. That is brought to you by my two sponsors. The first one is going to be Optimal Carnivore. This is their new Brain Nourish product. I have been using it prenatally as well as giving it to my daughter and husband. It is fabulous to improve mental acuity. It is beef brain and lion's mane, a really great product. They also have wonderful beef organs as well as beef liver. These are all sustainably sourced, and you can use my code carnivore uppercase Y to save 10% on these. The second sponsor of today's episode is Upgraded Formulas. This is their magnesium formula, which I take every night before bed, which I love. My code there is Yogi12 or Yogi to save. I also love their hair tissue mineral analysis for helping you to understand the intricacies of your mineral balance. So check them out. Again, Yogi or Yogi12 to save. And I hope that you enjoy today's episode. I'll talk to you soon. All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. I am really excited about today's guest, Ian Mitchell. He is a brilliant researcher, an inventor, biochemist, and pharmaceutical developer, and he specializes a lot in anti-aging technology, peak performance. He's worked with all kinds of superstar names that you've probably heard of: Dave Asprey, David Sinclair, athletes, NASA. So I'm just super thrilled to have you here today, Ian. Thank you for being here.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, I think I'm going to shift the focus of my research specifically to the beneficial effects of Twinkies. So the more artificial, the better. So yeah.
Well, that might throw my audience off just a little bit because most of them have gotten rid of Twinkies on the quest for optimal health. So
the benefits of pectin A. Yeah. So we're going to do all the detrimental effects are now going to be beneficial effects. Yeah. I actually, my kids make a joke about that because I don't know, I forget, probably 10 years ago or something, someone brought a box of Twinkies into the house and I literally crushed it and threw it away.
Yeah. Oh my gosh.
Well, it registered to me as like a toxin, right? I looked at it, it was like, oh my God, someone's trying to poison my kids. Turns out it was my kids trying to poison my kids. But
yeah. I can't believe we used to eat those growing up. I mean, I grew up in the 80s and 90s, and those were like staples, you know, the little Debbies and the Twinkies, and that's just what we ate. And Pop-Tarts for breakfast, and just like part of the part of growing up.
Well, you know, I was lucky. My mom, you know, I grew up in New Orleans, but my mom was kind of counterculture. So, you know, I didn't have any sodas. I didn't have any chocolate. I was one of those, you know, granola kids who went to the co-op and got carob. So,
I had a friend like that. And her mom was like, we've made the decision not to eat sugar in our home. So for her birthday, we have a carob cake. And I was like, great, it's a cake. It must still be delicious. And I was like, whoa, what is this? This is terrible. When you're used to eating all the other stuff and you get carob, you're like, oh my God.
I wish someone had clued her in and been like, 70% cacao, all good. So,
yes, that's what we
sadly,
use.
Yeah. Well, that's actually, I mean, it's got so many beneficial things in it. It's well worth it to do it. I keep it around the lab all the time now. So.
Oh yeah. Well, and the funny thing is having that conversation, those of us that did grow up in that time period, we were really not exposed to a lot of the same things that the kids today are. We played outside. We didn't have cell phones. We didn't have iPads. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have, at least I'll be 43 tomorrow, actually. So I didn't have a cell phone until I was in my 20s. I wasn't exposed to all that radiation. So and we were outside playing. Like we played outside. We rode our bikes all the time. We'd go and just stay out all day. And I feel like that kind of maybe balanced out some of the crappy food that we ate, because our bodies were not dealing with stress from all ends. We weren't constantly being blasted with radiation. So I don't know. That's my theory.
I think the science backs that up. The problem is with exposure to EMFs, you get dysregulation of voltage-gated calcium ion channels, throughout pretty much every cell in your body. And, when you have a cell phone and you smack it up to your ear, I know that, a lot of people are like, oh, it shows nothing. No, actually, the results are pretty much in. You can disrupt voltage-gated calcium flow if you just use a cell phone. It's by far and away many, many orders of magnitude stronger than you actually need to disrupt that flow, because everything in your body is kind of in a very well-established homeostatic balance, right? And if you throw something out like, I don't know, say, ion potentiation, you can throw things off, and it sounds simple, but it's literally, it's kind of the sort of the critical point analysis of what is the one little bitty thing you can do that sets a cascade in effect that stops everything. The example that you always hear about critical point analysis is the one thing that you can put your finger on that will stop a locomotive. And that's, it's true, right? If you know exactly the right spot, you can just interrupt one small pattern. And unfortunately, our society is kind of built up around the idea of like everything electronic. It makes life better, and right. I always joke around here, better living through chemistry, because sometimes, if you do it the right way, you can actually affect positive change in things. But a lot of the things that we're exposed to, turns out, genetically modifying, grains wasn't actually such a glorious idea.
No. No.
Who knew? Nature had actually kind of worked that stuff out, and the unintended consequences of us meddling with it are a little off. It always, I don't know if you recall, when genomics was kind of first kicking off and people were looking at the breakdown of things and they started looking at the human genome, they'd go, well, there's just a small percentage of actual data and the rest is junk DNA. And it was kind of like junk DNA was almost like fake news. It was like, it's 50% junk DNA. Then someone would make a discovery and go, that's 40%. That's 30%, right? And they kept having to revise the numbers because, again, nature, being a relatively smart system over millions and millions of years, has kind of drilled down and figured out what works and what doesn't. Which is why I try and work on a lot of things that deal with mitochondria, is because rather than try and go out to the outside, it's a Thoreau thing of, for every 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil, there's one hacking at the root. You want to be the cat hacking at the root, right? You want to affect the problem where it's actually originating, because it, like everything else that cascades up, if you provide something beneficial at kind of the origin of the issue, then it will work itself out. And so mitochondria, in terms of, humans and human performance, that's really, in my opinion, sort of the sweet spot. It's actually, it's mitochondria, but most people kind of approach it from, and this is where a lot of the research that I'm doing starts to seem a little woo. I mean, it's repeatable and we can replicate the experiments, but they do seem a little peculiar, because I did a conference last year in September and I did a demonstration in front of a crowd. And literally every single person in the auditorium walked up at the end of it, because it truly, it looked like a magic trick more than it did a biological demonstration. And it was a fellow that I know has a really bad crab allergy or shellfish allergy. And so it
Oh
was regarding
yeah, Todd, right?
histamines. Yeah, Todd.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. And so I brought Todd on stage and used a derma roller and derma rolled his arm, which is just, a series of little needles at, 0.25 millimeters. And so it's very, very little holes, but it's kind of the equivalent of doing the old dermal stamp test that you'd go to an allergist and get to see what your body has a histamine reaction with. So I derma rolled his right arm, and then I opened a can of crab and put the juice from the crab on it, and instantly, his arm blows up. And then I put it in this thing called a quantum block, and to modulate subtle behavior. And that's where people kind of like, well, if it doesn't have magnets and it doesn't have power, it can't be doing anything. Well, not really true. Most matter isn't magnetic, nor does it have power, applied. And it still is doing something, right?
Yeah.
So I took it out just after a couple of minutes about lecturing on waveform dynamics a little bit and quantum behavior. And then I derma rolled his other arm and put the crab juice from the same can on it, and nothing happened. There was no reaction. And it was kind of like a lot of the audience, it sort of seemed like, like a puppy that had heard a new sound.
Wow. So you put the crab into the quantum block and let it
I put the crab
in
into the quantum block. Right. So effectively, when you
okay.
have a histologic reaction, you're not actually reacting to the compound in terms of its origin, right? So the compound is an aggregate of vibrations, right? If you look at the physics of all this, it kind of makes sense, but you don't normally walk through your day going, oh, everything is vibrating, vibrating bits of energy. Well, really, that's kind of how it is, right? We never actually touch or interact with another person. It's all, anything that we have, it's the interaction of, electron clouds pushing on other electron clouds. We call it touch, but really it's very, very, nanoscopic repulsion of things at very subtle levels. And the same applies to, histology. Like if you look at somebody that's having a histamine reaction, you look at what's actually going on. Basically, it's destructive interference of harmonics, right? So you've got, when things interact in terms of waveforms, you have either constructive or destructive interference. And when something registers as constructive, your body has no issues with it. If it registers as destructive interference, then it has a problem. That waveform cascades up negatively. And then it, would become the atoms, the molecules, and then ultimately some sort of histamine reaction. Well, if you go back and you kind of sand the edges of the things that you're having a problem with at a very subtle level before they even become physical, then when that stuff cascades up, it no longer has a reaction, which is why it seems like a magic trick, because people don't really assess things on subtle levels. But the same thing. This is why with my students, I always used to teach that science is a point on a line, right? And that's the best science that we have anywhere in the world. 1,000 years from now, assuming we don't obliterate ourselves, will seem almost laughable to to the people
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's
what seems woo right now is going to just seem like, yeah, obviously, like,
well, imagine pre-von Leeuwenhoek when nobody had microscopes. If you said they're little bugs and these little bitty bugs that you can't see are affecting your body, and right. Well, yes. That sounds like they would have been like, burn them, crazy pants to the stake.
Yeah.
But now the moment that kicks in and we have the tools to assess it and look at it and go, oh, well, you look at that, little microorganisms. Wow, who knew? Well, I'm sure some people knew, but they were probably laughed at, and the same thing applies now. That's why I say it's just a point on a line. Is the best tech we have today. Newton went around for a couple hundred years. I mean, his tech was arguably the best stuff in the world. Then Einstein rolls around and goes, yeah, but, and then adds to it. And that's kind of the beauty of the iterative process of science, is that we add to the collective knowledge base of humanity so that as a species we can move forward. It's a little bit off kilter now, perhaps more so than it has been previously, in my opinion. But that's okay. It's slowly but surely we'll get there.
I agree. And, going back to the things that we can't see, I think EMF is right there right now, because anytime, or non-native EMF. I mean, EMF is, you have EMF,
It's
I have
sure.
EMF. The earth has EMF, like the
Yeah.
Schumann resonance. It's not a bad, EMF is not bad, but non-native EMF is one of those things that you talk about and people get mad. They, oh, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. Your AirPods are not affecting you. Microwaves are, you know,
Right.
they get angry. And I've even had people in the quantum space, which is pretty shocking to me, say, you know, anybody who preaches about non-native EMF and AirPods being harmful is completely wrong and completely doesn't understand quantum physics. And I'm like,
I'm going to hazard a guess that they may not understand quantum physics. So
agreed. Agreed. I mean, you talked a little bit about the calcium channel. Can you break this down a little bit more for people that are just like skeptical, don't really understand how it works, how this kind of dehydrates our cells, breaks down on our easy water, takes down our water energy battery in the body? Like,
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So basically, when you're throwing that out there, so EZ is short for exclusion zone, not EASY, but actually EZ is in the acronym for it, or the abbreviation rather. Gerald Pollack's work, he wrote a book called The Fourth Phase of Water, which is a great book. It was one of the 2 books I had on my required reading list for my seniors taking biochemistry from me at the university. So it's well worth the read. But the basic idea boils down to things in nature kind of stratify, right? Most things are batteries, if you will, and they have a positive side and a negative side. And there's a dynamic interaction that has to occur. And if you alter that interaction or change the way things are gated, then you end up with detrimental outcomes. If you say you sprain your ankle and you get a micro fissure, well, the reason that all of the fluid starts to aggregate there isn't necessarily lymph pumping down instantly into that area because of pressure, which is kind of how most people think of it as, oh, it's a pressurized system. It's not so much a pressurized system as it's an ionically based system. So things are moving based on charge potentials, right? So it's the same way that our cells work, right? If you want to really affect the way mitochondria functions, you simply make sure that it's hydrated properly, which means you provide it with the right constituents, because your body's actually not using the water so much that you drink as it is producing the water that you ultimately use by restructuring it through a process through your mitochondria. So you have to provide all the constituent parts. And in your mitochondria, if you want to beneficially affect things, you make sure that you have enough ATP coming out. And how do you do that? Well, you have to negate some of the oxidative stress load, right? Because everything's kind of a scramble for protons and electrons, right? So again, you're looking at the positives and the negatives of how things move inside cells. One of the things with viruses that's kind of interesting is 5G very detrimentally affects viruses, right? So, and that's not some woo-woo strange conspiracy theory thing. It's just because of voltage-gated calcium ion potentiation, right? So all that has to happen is if you create a higher acidity in that sort of environment, then it's more beneficial and easier for a virus to pull protons and to actually replicate. It's just, it's basic biochem. So it's not some nefarious plot, but yeah, if you're exposed to a lot of EMFs, very often it will provide a more effective sort of environment for viruses and things to propagate. And it's just, it's just positives and negatives. It's not really any strange thing. So what happens when you're looking at how EMFs affect things, you have something that has a much stronger charge. In a good way, and I've never really thought about trying to come up with an analogy for it, but let's suppose you had a piece of wood and you had a bunch of little steel BBs or something, little ball bearings, and you're trying to roll them off. Well, if it's got to go off in a specific pattern because you have little openings at the end of the board that they have to roll out of, normally it's tilted and they roll down. But if you put a strong magnet on one side, some of them are going to start to bind over on the side, and it's going to block the flow. And effectively, that's what happens with EMFs is the calcium channels, there's a really balanced exchange. And as long as it's a balanced exchange, your body's fine. It's in that kind of homeostatic window that it tries to keep itself in, and everything flows. If you shift that out and you have too much positive or too much negative, it doesn't really matter. Out of balance is still out of balance.
Yes.
then what happens is the potentiation and the flows don't match. And so you end up slowing the process down. And so all of the different processes intracellularly start to dysregulate, right? You don't process toxins out. The lymphatics inside cells don't actually work properly. And when you end up with an imbalance there, it's that same cascading effect that I was talking about. It just kind of falls down the line, and you end up with a larger and larger and larger dysregulation until it goes from, it's kind of paracrine signaling, right? It's signaling within one system, and it starts at a very small level and then cascades up and becomes, a larger systemic sort of effect. And so that's the basics. It's just, we're a balanced system that has been built and tested over, millennia. And we're suddenly being exposed to things in greater degrees than we would have been in, as you said, a native environment. And so it's just simple dysregulation. It's not some big nefarious plot. It's not anything really strange. It's just, we're a very small thing, and we're exposed to very high strength fields. And, if anyone doesn't think that something you don't see is having an effect on you, put your hand in a microwave and let the magnetron do its thing. It's, I mean, we play with magnetrons around the lab for a lot of different experiments, and you have to shield, you have to get out of the way. We have, tri-field meters, and we also have Geiger counters around here for some of the other experiments, but you actually have to be cautious when you're dealing with those things, because if you're not, you'll end up damaging yourself. I mean, we have infrared lasers around here, and infrared laser, if you're not wearing eye protection, you're pickled, right? You'll just fry your retinas. And it's not something you can see, but it's something that still has a very pronounced biological impact. And I think if people would take the time to, maybe drill down and do the research, it would be an easier thing for them to understand, because the knowledge is out there definitively. I mean, there's so many papers in the literature that you can find about all the topics that we've just discussed. Some of it does seem a little fringe, and you get pushback, but usually you get pushback from people that have, kind of entrenched monetary interest, right? The cell phone companies, they're not going to want to say anything's bad. And I'm not some Luddite who's pushing for, like renouncing and going to live in a hut in the woods that I've built with, with an axe. I mean, I'm the first one to use, to use my laptop and use my phone. It's a trade-off, right? And so you have to look at it as kind of a balanced approach. You can't just say, "Oh my God, I'm going to get rid of all technology." That's never going to happen. The pace of advancement in the world, it's going to keep moving, right? Progress is just going to keep marching on. We're actually, 100 years ago, the environment was not that great. It was kind of the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and things were kind of being polluted environmentally. And now we're starting to see the after effects of that. Right now, we're in the technological revolution, and it's more subtle things, but it's still things. And so probably in, 50 to 100 years, we'll really see the effects of that. I mean, if you look at, not to say that this is causal, but if you look at a lot of the kind of oddities that are occurring in the world, birth rates going down and things like that. Yes. There's a lot of exposure to chemotoxicity and things like that are causing it, xeno and phytoestrogens and all sorts of stuff. But my guess would be that there's probably a subtle component there too, just because any system that's out of balance tends towards becoming more and more out of balance with little bitty stresses, right? If somebody's teetering on the edge of a cliff and you walk up and go, you don't have to run up and slam into them. It doesn't, once a system's already off kilter, it doesn't really take much to throw it that much farther out. So
I agree. Yeah. And I actually spoke with a cancer doctor yesterday. The reason I sought her out to interview her is because she's the only cancer doctor I've ever spoken with that tells people to turn the circuit breaker off, that tells people to, if they're going to have a cell phone, carry it on a cord, in a Faraday pouch. Like, she actually talks about this because she's seeing younger and younger and younger people come in with more and more serious cancers every single day. And I mean, cancer is a metabolic disease. Fertility issues, that's a metabolic issue as well. So many of these issues, like my husband he still thinks I'm a crazy Ghostbuster because I have a tri-field too. That he's like, great, now you're a Ghostbuster. You have all these like red light panels in the house, and you're stirring your water to structure it and doing all this crazy stuff and turning off all my electronics. And he's like, and now you're a Ghostbuster. But the only way I was able to conceive a baby at my age, I'll be 43 tomorrow, was I had to mitigate all of that stuff. That was, there were a lot of other things I did. I got rid of all the personal care products, quit doing all the makeup, haven't done my nails in 2 years, all that stuff. Yeah. Drink out of glass. But that was like that final piece I had to do, was understanding my environment. Like you said, once you get one of these meters and you start zapping your phone with it, or you turn on the microwave and you even just stand in the kitchen with the microwave on, you're like, oh, we're getting rid of the microwave. Sorry. Everything's going in the oven.
Yeah, I didn't have one for about 20 years. So
yeah.
I just got rid of it because I didn't want my kids around it, which,
No.
they were, I'm sure a lot of the things that I did with my kids, they were probably like, oh my God, my ridiculous dad, he does all this craziness. And admittedly, it was definitely different. But now I think they're kind of going, well, maybe there's some validity to that. Probably in another 20 years when they're my age, they'll be like, wow, okay, yeah, thanks.
Yeah, exactly.
It wasn't
Thanks for not letting
horrible.
us keep our iPads next to our heads and our, our reproductive organs, and letting us stay up on those things 24 hours a day. Like, yeah, exactly.
It's I have a friend who he's a biohacker guy, and he kept his cell phone in his pocket, and the leg that he kept it on, the bone density was 10% less.
Wow.
If you can
wow.
that substantially affect, the bone density in your femur just by virtue of having your cell phone in that pocket, there's an issue. And he's one of those guys that quantifies everything. And it's just, there are definitive effects there. People don't want to look at it again because I said, it's inconvenient. Having a phone and being able to do everything with it, sure, it's great. I'm not proposing that we get around that, but I am saying do things that mitigate it. That's why I like a lot of the quantum tech stuff, is because it's not actually that tricky to do things that mitigate the EMFs. Like with Lila Quantum, company that I do the science for, I'm their science advisor, and we've got dark field microscopy shots that show EMFs. You put somebody next to a quantum card or quantum block, and their blood completely shifts. It goes from being the little coin rolls where all the platelets are aggregating to actually moving back and dispersing to being able to flow the way that they're intended to flow. And it's really, again, you're affecting things at a subtle level beyond the level that we typically think of it. We think of all the things that are affecting your blood as something, physical and chemical.
Right.
There's an energetic component there too. Ask anybody who does research on mitochondria, right? If you look at the effects of mitochondria when you change the voltages around it or change the EMF field, it's easy to see under a scope. You can see what's going on. It's just the way the cells move really starts to change, right? They don't propagate as well. They don't proliferate as well. There's all sorts of stuff. It takes longer to reach confluence in a petri dish, right? You just can't grow them as quickly because things are impinged. The oncologist that you were talking with, I'm sure she's noted that, but you can very greatly affect, and this is a good thing, you can very greatly affect cancer cell proliferation if you simply shift some of those components. There's a thing called tumor treating field therapies that's an FDA approved therapy for thoracic cancers. And literally all it is it's an electric field, not an electromagnetic, but it is technically, but it's an electric field device, and it creates a field. And what happens is when cancer cells try to divide, they go through this process where they do a mitotic spindle formation, and it inhibits mitotic spindle formation. So the cancer cell can't copy itself. And cancer cells are different than most cells in that a normal cell, if it isn't able to replicate, it becomes senescent, which is, if you ever hear somebody throw around the term zombie cells, that's a senescent cell. It's not dead. It's just kind of loitering and screwing things up. It's effectively the bull in the biological china shop. Cancer cells don't do that, right? Normal somatic cells become senescent. Cancer cells go apoptotic, which just is, programmed cell death. They commit cell suicide. So if you can get a cancer cell to become kind of marginalized so that it can't replicate, it literally blows itself apart. And that's exactly how tumor treating field therapy works. And it was, based on some research from a group of Israeli researchers, and it's finally FDA approved. But it's been around, I think the first time I saw it was maybe a decade ago. And
Wow.
and I think at that point it had been around for a decade already. It just hadn't gone through all of the things to get approved. Interestingly, one of the things that's neat about the FDA approval for the tumor treating field therapy is it actually came with a quality of life statement, because it doesn't have the same effects that chemo or radiation.
Oh, yeah.
Right now, granted, it's only approved for thoracic use, so you can only use it in your torso. But it hopefully at some point will be approved for everything else. Although it is a little odd because the people that do it have to carry a battery pack around to actually, because
Wow.
it requires an electric field, so they actually have to carry a battery pack around. I'm sure the size has changed since the last time I looked at it. His batteries are a little bit better now, but effectively the same premise. You're going to be walking around with something, whether it's the size of your wallet or the size of a car battery, but it works. And I'd recommend anybody who doesn't think that EMFs affect things, look up tumor treating field therapy. It's an FDA approved process, and it seems to work. So
interesting. Well, so interesting what you were saying about the Leela block. Todd had one shipped to me, so I've got one. I'm kind of like, I don't know what to do with this, and of course, my husband chimes in. Oh, great! And like, what is this thing that you're carrying around the house with you? Because I've been like, if I'm going to be in the office around my laptop and everything, I'll just have the block kind of sitting on the floor near me, or if I'm in the kitchen cooking and doing things, I keep the block with me, and I keep like a shielding band around my belly to protect the baby. I have like the Get Lamb's belly band, and it's the thing about the block though, I can actually feel a difference when I have it around. But the one thing is I can't sleep, and I'm going to interview Philip in a few weeks, but I can't sleep with that thing in my bedroom. I don't understand why. Everything is unplugged, circuit breaker off in the bedroom. But like, if I have the block in there, I'm like awake. I don't understand what that's all about.
So I'll definitely, I think they keep me around as the token scientist, but, I'll go ahead and deviate a little bit, and this will seem somewhat woo-woo, but, humans are more than just the aggregate of all of the cells and this just big biological mass of squishy stuff. There's a consciousness at play. And, I've meditated for, I guess, a little over 30 years now, pretty intensely. And one of the things that you notice is the quantum block actually affects sort of the awareness in a localized space. And it's definitively altering the field of consciousness. And for, people who are going to argue that point, it's kind of difficult to really go into it right now. I mean, I can do some oddball experiments that show that there's something else happening, but truly, we don't really have the scientific tooling just yet. I'm hoping that at some point in the future they will, but we don't really have the tooling to be able to quantify that stuff. So it makes it very difficult to have a debate with someone on the merits of consciousness, because there's no consciousometer,
Right.
And actually, if you look at there's a fellow named David Hawkins who wrote.
I was going to bring that up. Yeah.
Who wrote Power versus Force, and Hawkins was an MD, PhD, and a very bright fellow, and very far along the curve in terms of kind of human potential. And Hawkins developed a map of consciousness, and it was a scale, a logarithmic scale based on the expression of consciousness. And it was based around the work of a fellow named John Diamond, who did kinesiology. And Hawkins realized that when you start to work with kinesiology, what's actually happening is non-local field effects, where you're tapping into the total field of conscious potential. And what I've been able to do in the lab, I wish I could have taken it further. Maybe with some stroke of insight or luck, at some point I will. But we have seen some very bizarre things and done things that, just in terms of combinatorial chemistry, where we'll come up with compounds that the odds of actually hitting the right compound on the first shot out of the gate were astronomically improbable, and yet we did. And we did it by virtue of me kind of going, hey, there's that Hawkins thing, let's try that, let's see if we can calibrate our way through this. And it sounds a little woo, but I got to tell you, some of in fact, one of the patents that we're filing right now was literally a direct result of using those techniques. And we arrived at things that I genuinely didn't think we would be able to do in a time frame that I didn't think we'd be able to sort it out. So I'm definitively a believer in that camp. There's something more happening than I can really articulate at this point. Maybe in my lifetime we'll figure it out. Maybe we won't. Maybe I'll be able to convey it to other scientists. Maybe I won't. But, on things like the quantum block, it's affecting consciousness. And when your consciousness moves up, your energy moves up, right? Your energetics move up. And you can see that. You can actually see that on a cellular level. If you look at blood work from somebody who's doing, hardcore meditation, there's a difference, right? And I mean, because I've done it for 30 years, I can literally, hook myself up to, pulse oximeter and change everything on there. I can hook myself up to thermal guns and change the, the heat output from any specific point in my body. And that's, it's because I had migraines as a kid. So I had to go through biofeedback therapy. So I spent years with, kind of like the Ghostbusters thing, effectively back then in the early 80s, a colander on my head with a lot of electrodes,
Yeah.
So, but that was it, and that was the best we had. But what you learn through doing, biofeedback or now neurofeedback is you learn that all of the systems that you're told are autonomous nervous system functions that you can't control. No, everything physiologically is under your control. You can control histamine reactions. You can control your heart rate, your blood pressure, your body temperature, anything, you can control pupillary dilation, like anything that's going on, you can basically affect it. Look at, Wim Hof. I mean, that guy's kind of a freak of nature, but he is very adept at controlling things. I mean, if you can shut down a histamine reaction after somebody's injected you with a toxin specifically to be able to measure it, you're doing pretty well. And that cat, he's got really phenomenal control of his own physiology. But that's kind of the realm that we're talking about, right? Where does the biology end? And where does the consciousness start to express through the biology?
Yeah, exactly.
And that's kind of, for me, that's kind of the realm of, sort of the quantum biology, which is really amazing because, and personally, I like that because the puzzles are neat, right? The answers aren't, it's not something I can just pull up, PubMed and go through it and find an article and then read that guy's research and have all the answers. There are a lot of things, the other book on my required reading list for my class was, Life on the Edge, which is all about quantum biology. And it's, I'd recommend that people read up on it because it seems like a somewhat fringy topic now, but it's matter of fact. I mean, and every day that goes by, people are discerning more and more things that really fall into quantum biology as opposed to the old way we used to think about things in terms of, sort of mechanistic biology. And, I actually had my students, one of the things I wanted them to do was look for things that haven't been identified already in literature that are providing quantum effects, and not that you can necessarily prove it, but you can at least postulate. My thing is I like to try and get the people around me to think, because, my dad, he was a really brilliant guy and he taught anthropology and archaeology and he still is constantly thinking outside of the box and coming up with concepts that just kind of make me go, wow, that's brilliant. I had never looked at it like that. And it's been beneficial for me to be able to kind of pull back from things and with a degree of objectivity, look at it and go, how is this actually functioning? Maybe all of the things that we are assuming aren't actually there. My favorite television program of all time was this British show called Connections. It was a British journalist named James Burke, and he did this entire series. And what it did was, and honestly, it was probably pretty formative for me in my life. He would take one invention that's a modern thing that we have, like a missile or the TV, and then he would trace it all the way back through time to its very inception and look at all of the different components that had to come together to create that invention. And it used to be that, someone would come up with some sort of technology, and then 20 years later, or 30 years later, or 50 years later, somebody else would go, hey, I can take that and modify it a little bit. And then that would cascade up through time, and somebody else would do something. And then you'd end up with, a thing at the end of that. Now, because of the degree of communication that we have, everything is so connected the rapidity of change is just moving at an exponential rate. I wrote a paper, it's probably been a decade ago, called Cultural Calculus, because it was about the rate of change in society. And, you know, people always said, you know, technology expands exponentially. No, it really didn't, in my supposition. What was happening is you were looking at an exponential expansion in population, right? And a larger population moving at a great rate, coming up with different ideas, has the appearance of technological, you know, expansion at an exponential rate, but it's not. The two things are linked, right? You have an exponential expansion in population tied to new technologies being developed. So those things were just moving in parallel, and they were at the same rate. Now that you've had, you know, population growth as a concurrent function with technological communication and all of the interconnections, it's really more of a cubic function, right? So it ceases to be just kind of a 2-axis function and becomes a 3-axis function. And you get something that's, you know, really, really intense. And that's why I think the pace of change is daunting sometimes, is because we've got this kind of thing where we're literally ceasing to be, you know, a species that increases its knowledge base on 2 axes and is moving into, you know, a third. And so volumetrically, we're just expanding a huge amount of data all the time, far more than people can consume or process. You know, it's, you know, such is my supposition, at least. It's kind of hard to hold on sometimes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I'd love to jump into a little bit of talking about C60, because this is one of those things I think people are starting to kind of want to know a little bit more about. It's been around for a while, right?
Yeah, I think the fellows who discovered it in 1985 and got the Nobel Prize in 96, if memory serves. And I think they were doing something that they probably didn't realize the far-reaching effects of at the time. You know, I mean, it's pretty impressive stuff. So it's, for people who aren't familiar with it, it's carbon 60, right? And it's just 60 carbon atoms clustered together in a truncated icosahedron, also lovingly known as a soccer ball, right? So, initially, people, I think, were approaching it more from an inorganic standpoint, thinking like, oh, look, we've got nanoscopic bearings. We can use it as a lubricant. And it is. I mean, it's insanely lubricous. I mean, it's great. That's why a lot of people in the oil field use it, because it, you know, little nanoscopic balls, basically. So it knocks out friction. But some researchers in the late 90s started playing with it and binding it to fats, right? Because it's hydrophobic, just meaning it pushes away from water and doesn't bind. But it's lipophilic, which means it will bind to a fat. And so some guys got the bright idea of binding it to fats to see what the effects were. And then around 2007, if memory serves, they did an LD50 study, which is a lethal dosing study, where you take a population of mice and you see, or rats, in this case, they use rats, and you see, what does it take? You know, how much of the compound has to be administered before it kills 50% of the population, right? And that's actually, unfortunately for the rodents, that's kind of a standard study that you do with new compounds. But in this case, what was found, and they published in 2012, I believe, and what was found was kind of bizarre, because, and I remember the first time I read the paper, I thought, it seems kind of like bullshit. I don't know that I can buy that. It's just too bizarre, because they found that the control group died. The first experimental group with just lipids, in that case it was olive oil, died. And the experimental group that had the carbon 60 bound to the olive oil, they were just humming along just ducky. And their survival rate was 90% longer than the control rate. And that was a little over the top. And, you know, and I thought, 90% extension, that can't possibly be right, you know?
Wow.
So
yeah.
What do you do when you hit something like that? You recreate the experiment. Now, I didn't want to use it. It took them 5 years to do the experiment, because they used Worcester rats, and, you know, normal lifespan is about 26 months. And I think their longest lived rat was about 5 years. They had just about doubled its lifespan.
Wow.
And turns out that they actually sacrificed the last animal because they wanted to be able to publish, which seems a little unfortunately short-sighted, because
Wow.
I kind of would have taken the Methuselah rodent approach and been like, like taking bets and the over-under of how long we're going to keep this little guy alive in the lab. But they wanted to publish, so they sacrificed the last animal, did the necropsy on it, looked at everything, and then published the study. And they did get some pushback because it seemed really strange. And I don't think anybody else has recreated the experiment, but I didn't want to wait that long, so I used p53 knockout mice. And p53 is your tumor suppressor gene, so you can have mice that are genetically altered so they lack the tumor suppressor gene. So I was still dealing with a mammal because I wanted to keep it in the mammalian group. So still playing with a mammal, but their lifespan is very short. So p53 knockout mice, you use them in oncology a lot, right? So if you're doing something and you want to see what the effects are, they have a kind of an idiopathic presentation of tumors, which is the fancy medical way of saying they spontaneously produce tumors just randomly all over their body. They're the unfortunate little guys that you see with the little bulbous tumors popping out everywhere. But we literally genetically designed them for that. So that's kind of their lot in life, is to, have a tumor. So I stuck with those guys because they have insanely well-defined mortality curves, because at this point, probably tens, if not hundreds of thousands of p53 knockout mice have been used. So, within a very narrow band, whether it's heterozygous, homozygous, or wild type, exactly when those guys are going to die. Again, within a pretty tight variance, just because of the sheer volume of past, I don't know, probably 15 years-ish. So I knew that I would have a very specific period, about 6 months, that they would be, hanging out. So I took them, I started administering the compounds, going through, and then sure enough, it was very bizarre. They lived on average 93% longer than they should have lived. And the very bizarre thing was that they did not die of tumors. They just had organ failure. Yeah, most of them. And in fact, the very first rodent that died, I did the necropsy myself. And when I opened it up, I was looking around thinking, where's the tumor? And it had died of a femoral hemorrhage. And I thought, oh, wow, well, that makes no sense. And I thought, I must just be bad at this. I'm not a, veterinary pathologist. This isn't what I do. So I'm going to send it out. So the next time I got a veterinary pathologist, and I, took the mouse as soon as it died, overnighted it, chilled, overnighted it to the pathologist, had him do a full workup, histology, everything, no tumors. And I thought, wow. What? And so consistently we did that throughout the whole cohort. And one was kind of inconclusive, I think, but that was it, and then one had a small tumor, small, truly small, but it didn't die of that. It died of another system failing. And then one was inconclusive, and the others had none, which was kind of a bizarre result for mice that are specifically designed in their genetic fate and destiny is basically to die of tumors, and they didn't die of tumors. So that in and of itself was a weird result and kind of pushed me in one direction. But the other and just more overarching thing was 93% extension in lifespan. So Faki Moose's group in France, they got a 90% extension, which I was kind of questioning about. And then I got a 93%. And at that point I thought, okay, that's far too narrow a variance. There's obviously something going on here, because that's not some statistical aberration. We're both not going to just randomly end up with entire cohorts of mice living that long. So at that point, I really kind of went whole hog and got all the equipment to play with, and have since built my own carbon arc and all sorts of stuff to play with it and deal with it. And it's remarkable. Just in terms of the things that I've seen that really blow me away are the way you can get mitochondria to function, just amazing, right? Because if you look at the kind of cellular energetics and say that there's an up cycle and a down cycle, right? So you're trying to add energy, and then you have a loss of energy. So you're trying to add it, and you're trying to keep from losing it. So C60 isn't so much additive as it just stops system loss, right? You think of it as kind of like insulation for the walls of your cells. So what happens is the C60, because of its size, and when you bind it to a lipid, the binding to the lipid allows it to move past the cell membrane, right? So it moves past the cell membrane, then delocalizes from the lipid. And when the lipid gets metabolized, and then it finds its way to the mitochondrial membrane. And there's a really good NIH paper that you can look up on that. And when it ends up and it's translocated in the mitochondrial membrane, well, it's a very strong antioxidant. So when you get reactive oxygen species that are trying to interact with the mitochondria, it blocks that reaction. So very simple outcome is you negate reactive oxygen species interference. And what happens? Well, you've got a lot more energy left to play with. So the net effect is ATP output goes up somewhere between 18 and 58%. And those are really, you know, for anybody who actually is a researcher that plays with that, those are insane numbers. They're very, very big. And that's just on the side of blocking system loss. So over the past couple of years, with my wizard science stuff, what I've tried to figure out how to do is block the system loss and then add back energy. So I did that with another friend of mine is he does a lot of work with nicotinamide mononucleotide and resveratrol. And so NMN and resveratrol, if you balance the ratios out on those, you add energy into the system, right? Because they're NAD precursors. And so if you add NAD precursors to boost the energetics, at the same time you're negating the system loss, you end up with a very robust profile in terms of ATP output and performance and cellular resilience, and everything just functions more effectively. You know, I know we've talked before about, you know, it seems a little weird, like you can do one thing and then it has all these great effects across a whole host of different physical systems. Well, yeah, but we're basically built in the same building blocks, right? And so if you have faulty building blocks, you're going to have faulty outcomes. If you negate that and you actually soup up, you know, the very basic building blocks that we're playing with across all systems, your endocrine system, you know, your gastrointestinal tract, like all that stuff, your cardiac, right? Like everything becomes better and stronger, because I think that the first thing I patented on this was maybe 2013 or 2014, and it was cellular enhancements in biological systems was the first part of the patent, and it was through the use of lipofullerene peptide combinations, I think, because I was playing in front of my peptide synthesis machine. I was playing with how you could affect changes using peptide groups as well as C60 as kind of a combinatorial thing. And the effects were great, you know, and that was, you know, that was almost a decade ago, right? So the things that I'm able to do now, I've increased bioavailability. I've figured out how to maximize the amount of C60 that I could actually get to bind in the lipids, increase the bioavailability of the lipid-bound C60. And, you know, it's great. I mean, it's good stuff. Hopefully it finds its way into mainstream medical use. I know there are a lot of functional medicine doctors that are using it currently, with great results. You know, the guys who are doing a lot of pro athletes, you know, guys that are kind of running in the CrossFit games that are, you know, top tier guys, which is nice for me, are seeing great effects. Well, it's great because pro athletes, you know, I one of the things that I make is called the Olympic serum, and that was made for guys who are actually going out for the Olympics, because they were looking for, you know, 1 to 2% effects, and it was guys that were doing pole vaulting, or as I called it, reverse limbo. And so I made their reverse limbo serum before it was actually something, and gave it to them, and they started getting these really bizarre results between 13 and 17% jumps in performance. And one of the guys, I have the picture, it always cracks me up. They measure, because they have to do the kind of rotation at the top. Their grip strength is insane. You know, they're almost like crabs. It's just this off the charts grip strength. And so for those guys, they would have these very precise grip strength meters, and the digital readout typically is around 150 pounds. And that's, you know, doesn't sound like a big number, but that's a lot of grip strength. And they started going upwards of 200 pounds. And then one of the guys actually cracked the machine. We don't know where it was, but it was well over 200 pounds. And that became a consistent function. And it's just because of additional muscle recruitment. It's not actually, you know, you up the ATP level and you change the way that you're able to recruit your muscle fibers. And you don't have to change your size, but you can, in a sprint, change your muscular output. And so that's, you know, the sarcomeres are the muscle fibers. Your sarcomeric potential goes up because you can get them to fire in a dose dependent fashion. So the more of the compound that you take, the more easily you're able to fire the muscles as a group. So effectively your muscle recruitment is much higher, which is why I actually tell all the athletes who use it, like, it's great. You're going to feel super empowered. You'll be able to do things that you're not able to do normally. Go easy, because those guys sometimes are like, oh, if I can do 10% more, I'll do 50% more.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. And your muscular output, that's fine. Your muscles can handle it. But all of the different components of the connective tissue, your body's not designed for that. Actually, what's interesting, and people don't generally know this, is your muscular output is typically a quarter to a third of what its actual capacity is, right? Your brain downregulates your muscle potentiation. You normally fire about 25 to 33% of what you can actually do, and that's it.
Really?
Yeah, and if you end up in some sort of life-threatening situation, and you have a fight or flight reaction, your body pumps itself full of adrenaline, norepinephrine, and all that stuff, then suddenly you can fire all of it, and you're doing these super Herculean things. Well, it's not intended to be a function that's consistent, right? Because your connective tissue can't handle that. Your muscles can move more rapidly and adjust to things because they have blood flow, but all of the things that are connective tissue related, your body doesn't pump out chondrocytes to make new connective tissue as rapidly as it does muscle tissue. So skeletal muscle propagates pretty quickly and repairs really quickly. The chondrocytic things don't, right? Your ligaments and tendons kind of slow moving comparatively. So I always just tell people, like, look, you'll be able to do these great things, but don't just back down.
Right.
And it's neat for me when I see performance athletes, because those guys really are, they're operating at the very top edge of what is physically possible. So, in the case of one of the big CrossFit guys, I was talking to him and he said, I took a teaspoon of this stuff and I ran faster than I've ever run. And I had better performance than I've had literally for the past 7 years. And he showed me, like what he was talking about in terms of lifts and things. And I could never lift that much weight, but those guys are like, it's just impressive to me that, and they're effectively for themselves, they're kind of rolling the clock back to when they were in their peak condition. Wow. But again, it's all just cellular function, right? You tweak the building blocks cascade up into different systems. Those systems function more effectively, and you've got the capacity to do all these things that you haven't done for a long time, which is, I know you've seen the neural serum, and the neural serum is basically designed to do the same thing. The difference between the two serums that, the Olympic and the neural, Olympic is designed for most of your body. Neural is specifically designed to target your brain. And how you do that is you let the body do the sorting and the lifting, right? You couple it with different lipids, because when your body processes a fat, it processes different fats differently. So a medium chain triglyceride gets processed by your liver, and a lot of the ketone bodies that it's broken down to move directly to your brain. So if you adduct nanoparticles to those, you can get them to translocate to your brain really rapidly. The long chain fatty acids like olive oil and avocado oil, those are, primarily oleic acid constituents. You use those and they go all the way through your GI system. They get in your small intestine, get in your bloodstream, and then kind of go through the rest of the cells in your body. So they're kind of targeted towards somatic cells and not neurons. So you let the body just kind of do its thing. One of my presuppositions with all this stuff is that bodies are, I don't know how scientists look at physical systems and aren't just dumbfounded every day, right? Like, this is, as an organism, we are remarkable, just like truly remarkable. And if you're not almost in awe that every time you look at it, you're not paying attention. It's kind of like, Feynman said about quantum physics, if you're not just kind of, wow, shocked by it, then you really don't get it. And the same thing applies to biology. If you don't look at this system and go, my God, what an amazingly well orchestrated, balanced, dynamic system, in my opinion, you're not with it. You're not paying attention, because it's remarkable. And to do these little things that allow the body to kind of express its own brilliance, that's sort of what my MO is, to make subtle changes that allow you to express what your physiological potential is. And so far it seems to be working pretty well, because, people are having positive and beneficial effects. People's brains seem to be functioning. A lot of the stuff that I've worked on wasn't really for peak athleticism or things like that. Like the basis for the stuff that I had done for the Olympic athletes was compounds that I had worked on for people who had muscular issues and joint issues, who had autoimmune conditions, because there's a real direct correlation with joint pain and inflammatory responses and cytokine levels being really high and autoimmune conditions. And so I wanted to negate that. But if you don't have those problems, then what you note is just this ridiculous performance, kind of like the neural serum. It was developed for people with Alzheimer's. And I took my own assessment of what all the components of that particular disease were. And I came up with things that would address in aggregate the totality of that as a system, because I didn't think you could come up with, and I could be wrong, maybe somebody sharper could probably do it, but I couldn't figure out how to come up with one little molecule that would negate all of the different processes that in aggregate we call, Alzheimer's. So I came up with these, little components that did all these different things. And it has, this is totally anecdotal because we haven't done the trials yet, but in people that have issues like that, it makes a profound difference. For people that don't have issues like that, it gives you an incredible boost as a nootropic. So, I take this stuff all the time. And I think, actually our mutual friend, Todd's wife, Jill went from, and this is quite literal, Jill went from not being able to read, more than a couple of sentences to being able to read a book a day as a result
of the neural.
Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. Well,
I've been giving it to my daughter every day for the last couple of months now. So
good. Yeah.
Yeah. I just got a subscription, so we keep getting it.
Yeah. It's, take some yourself. It's,
it really, is it okay for pregnancy to take it?
Well, you can never actually recommend for fear of saying, sure, give it to small children. Yeah. You can't really recommend that. Medically, or you'll be lambasted. But
exactly.
What
I feel like I'm like, am I supposed to avoid everything?
Hermetically seal yourself into a glass sphere and stay there for the next 9 months.
Well, all the cool stuff's been coming out. I'm like, I haven't tried methylene blue. I'm like, because you get the warning. So
yeah, I actually, there's a company where I do a lot of the applied biochemistry that works with methylene blue, and I developed a non-addictive opioid for those guys. I would, if you're pregnant, I would avoid the methylene blue, actually.
That's what I concluded. Yeah.
Probably not the best thing. The C60, I actually, if it were me, I would do it. I would actually take that because I think it would probably have a very positive effect. But yeah, the methylene blue, I think I might just walk away.
Yeah, I'm going to wait till after breastfeeding and all that is done. And then I'm going to try the methylene blue. Not going to experiment. The C60, the one thing I was interested about, and I'm going to try some out because I ordered enough so that I could try some whenever we get our shipment. There's a component where there's some EMF protection. Am I understanding that correctly? Or how does that
that's
work?
True. It's not something that's really, it's not built that way, but it just, as a compound, it has a lot of innate properties that block the detrimental effects of EMF. And, we're not exactly sure as to what the rationale is for that, but it does work. One of the more interesting applications is 2 years ago, I had worked with an apiary for their bee colonies, because a lot of the issues that bee colonies had in the past couple of years, over the past decade, really, there were two primary functions that were really throwing things off. Exposure to neonicotinoids and then exposure to EMFs, right? And so people can wrap their head around like, toxic chemical, bad for bees, bad chemical, bad for bees. Easy to grasp. The one that's trickier is cell towers, bad for bees. Well, the same thing applies, right? Voltage gated calcium ion channels. If it's enough to knock it off through our thick skull, it's very, very more than you'd be required to throw things off for navigation for insects. And that's exactly what was going on. Is so a lot of those things were creating problems for bees for navigation, where they could not find their way back to their hive. And, that's not such a good thing. So a couple of years ago, working with this apiary, we did a trial where I developed some compounds for administration to the bees. And it takes I mean, they're little bitty critters, right? So it takes a very small amount to do it. But, you know, after the administration to those guys, we found that all of the colonies thrived. They didn't have, you know, any problems with them. After wintering, they were stronger. It just seemed to make them much like it does in a mammalian system. It made them far more robust, and they did not have the issues with navigation that they had previously. Also, and I know this from, you know, from the biology of C60 in mammals, it takes about 2.5 or 2.25 times, probably is more accurate, carbon tetrachloride to knock out a lab animal if you give them C60. Because much like, you know, if somebody had alcohol poisoning or something like that, what do? You pump them full of activated charcoal, right? The carbon binds to the toxins and it takes it out of the system, buffers, you know, renally and hepatically buffers it so that you don't have a problem. Well, C60 is the same way. It's almost kind of like inline dialysis. You know, when you get enough of it in the system, it blocks the effects of the chemotoxicity. So it negated some of the effects of the neonicotinoid exposure for the insects, as well as blocking, you know, the detrimental effects for their navigation on the EMFs. You know, I don't know if that'll ever see the light of day, but it was very neat. Actually, I was a friend of mine is one of the Nobel laureates who discovered C60. I introduced myself to him a couple years back, and he's a really Bob Curl is his name. He's a super genuine, nice older fellow who's a professor emeritus at Rice in Houston. And I went down and we were having lunch and we were talking about the different things I was working on. And I think the thing that he was most interested in, and I never really quite understood exactly why, but was the bees. And I think, you know, most people understand that are really bright, you know, if you affect a system like bees, then there are some very serious downstream effects for us as a species, right? It's, you know, much like our body is a balanced system, our ecology, you know, like the totality of the world as an ecological system is pretty balanced. And I think, you know, so you'd be hard pressed to watch a news segment without hearing something about the environment. You know,
Yeah,
you know,
exactly.
And that's our ecosystem, right? So we're affecting that, and it's not really lost on us. And I don't think it was lost on him that if you can affect in a positive fashion something as fundamental as bees, you know, they still account for, I think, 30+% of all pollination for crops is done via bees. You know, that's, you know, if you take out 30% of the world's food supply, probably not so good. You're probably going to have some grumpy people. You know, it'll be worse than a shortage of Mexican pizza at Taco Bell. You know, people will be really substantially upset.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think people realize that at all.
No.
Yeah.
Well, the system, you know, the frailty of the system, I mean, it's kind of interesting. Right. We have a very robust system that can take a lot of hits, but we also have a very frail system in that it's so beautifully well balanced that just one of the little tweaks in the wrong direction does have sort of an outsized effect rather. It's just, it takes a while. You know, I think the difficulty with a lot of this stuff is our lifespan on average, you know, unless you're schlepping back C60 all the time, our lifespan on average is about 80 years. And that's not really long enough to see the effects on a global scale of a lot of the things that we're doing. You know, if you were going to live a couple hundred years, you'd probably be far more invested in making sure that the environment were balanced and taken care of. For me, I probably have a different approach, as do you, because you've got kids, right?
Yeah.
I still have the old kind of crazy Boy Scout mindset of, you know, like, leave it better than you found it.
Exactly.
And so for me, a lot of this stuff is just me trying to, you know, leave it better than I found it.
Definitely. Absolutely. Well, one thing I know we've been talking for a while. Do you have time to cover one more topic?
Yeah, sure. Shoot.
Okay, cool. So one thing that a lot of my quantum friends, teachers talk about a lot is deuterium, right? And then when we start talking about supplementation, which, you know, for a while I was anti all supplements. Now I do take a couple. You know, how do you quantify the whole, you know, supplements are high in deuterium, we should avoid them? What would your explanation be for that? Or how would you address that?
I would say nowadays, pretty much everything, including people, are high in deuterium.
They are.
It's yeah, we're no longer in the 140s. We're smacking the 150s, I think, at this point.
Right.
And
Yeah,
that's really,
everyone's like 150 or above, I would guarantee.
yeah.
Yeah.
The,
Even on a
so
keto diet, that's the crazy thing. Even doing a ketogenic diet, you're probably still 150. Or
well,
maybe
yeah, I mean, you know, if
149,
you
but
think about it, the primary source of deuterium in your body by molecular count is over 99% water, right?
yeah.
So deuterium is something that people find in water, right? Because deuterium is
Yes.
heavy hydrogen, right? So when you're looking at deuterium, the big thing, and your audience can look up, there are about 700 or 800 published papers on deuterium depleted water and its beneficial effects, you know, for things like cancer. And a lot of the papers are from a fella named Laszlo
Laszlo
Boros.
Boros. I'm
Yeah.
trying to get him on the show. Yeah.
Yeah, and his research is really good. I've read a ton of it. It's really good. So deuterium is basically just in protium, which is the normal hydrogen. When you think hydrogen, you're actually thinking protium. You've got a proton and one orbital electron. So deuterium is a proton, a neutron, and one orbital electron. And the problem with that is the additional weight, right? So your atomic mass goes from 1 to 2, or almost 2, and if you think of it like, let's say you're serving, you know, you've got one of those tennis ball cannons and it's firing tennis balls and you're lobbing them back and lobbing them back, and then one of them comes across and is filled with lead. Well, when your racket contacts that, you know, you're going to feel it. And for your body, you know, as I had kind of said earlier, we make the water that we actually utilize, right? So inside your mitochondria, you have these little nanoscopic rotors that are humming at about 9,000 RPMs, and they're processing the water that you ingest to format it in a usable capacity for your body. And the little edges of those nanoscopic rotors, when something comes in that's twice the mass, it either damages the rotors beyond repair or just very much downregulates their function. And so you end up with less output, and that cascades up to become less ATP, less resilience, more damaged cells, more aberrant proteins, which lead to, you know, cancers. And I mean, there's kind of, it's that sort of that same paracrine cascade where in that particular system, it just cascades up and becomes a bigger and bigger problem. So with deuterium, because the weight is higher, you can either end up with deuterium, which is, you know, in the water sense, heavy water, right? Which is D2O. So 2 deuterium atoms and then 1 oxygen atom. Or you can end up with HDO, which is 1 deuterium, 1 protium, and then an oxygen. Or you can have the nice stuff that that we like, which is just H2O. So people, it's basically everywhere in water, and the rates have been going up for the past, I don't know, probably since we've been looking at it, maybe 30, 40 years. And I think there's a lot of people talk about, you know, maybe it's due to melting of the ice caps and the, you know, the deuterium that was captured. I would be inclined to think that since we're really looking at parts per billion in terms of our measurement, I think the thing that has probably thrown it out of kilter is nuclear power. And that's because you use deuterium to cool reactor cores, right? And because you know, you can fractionate out through Peltier cooling, you can fraction out the deuterium and use it and sell off everything you make, and you get on one side deuterium depleted water, which is really great biologically, and on the other side you get the heavy water, which you sell to reactors so they can use it for their cooling systems. But there's not enough produced, right? So what do? Well, they use a sulfonic process to artificially create deuterium, right? So they make just a ton of deuterium, and then they use that to cool the reactor core. So they're creating heavy water. Now, per the norms for the atomic regulatory agencies worldwide, not just here, but worldwide, when they're done with that, they literally just dump it in the ocean. So it's, you know, it's not irradiated, so it's not, you know, going to provide, you know, a reaction that's negatively impacting things in terms of radiation exposure. However, it is in fact a whole bunch of deuterium depleted or deuterium rich water. So the heavy water just goes back into the oceans. And, you know, if you look at the correlation between the rates going up and what we're doing in terms of nuclear power globally, there's an odd correlation. I don't know that I can definitively say yes, but if I had to hazard a guess, that's where my money would be, because as an organism, we evolve with a specific amount of deuterium in our body, and it's good, actually. It's beneficial when you're a teenager. You need it, and it stimulates cell growth and division, and it kind of pushes things forward. But when you get older, it's very detrimental. That's why there's so many papers on the beneficial effects of deuterium depleted water. Actually, incidentally, a friend of mine and I developed a new process to make it because it's stupid expensive, right? Like
I did 4 months of deuterium depleted water to get pregnant. And it was freaking awesome, but I spent a boatload of money. I did it from September to December. And then my coaches were like, well, if you want to get pregnant, you need deuterium. So the baby needs it. So don't drink it anymore. Like you got to get off of it. But yeah, it's really expensive. And when I talked about it on my last show, people were like looking it up and they're like, I'm not doing that. It's too expensive.
Well, yeah. So I'm actually, myself and one of my friends, we're about to launch some that's just going to be the cost of normal water. Yeah.
No freaking way. All right.
Yeah.
We need to stay in touch. Well, after the baby comes, I'm.
Yeah. You want to get back to it. That's exactly right.
Postpartum recovery. Yep.
Well, like most things, you want to stay in a range. You don't want to go to the gym and work out like 15 hours doing your max weight all the time. Right. No. We all know that's a recipe for disaster. You want to work out the right amount and deuterium is the same thing, right? Yeah. You need some of it. You don't want to deplete it too much. You don't want to have too much. It's kind of that Paracelsus thing, right? The dose makes the poison. So in this case, we came up with a new way to fractionate it and to separate the water so that we could take it out without it being insanely expensive. So it's a great thing if used properly, and it can really mitigate a lot of the damage that people are getting biologically. But it's untenable in terms of cost. I mean, you can't. I can't in good conscience recommend it to the average person. Go, sure, go spend $500 a month on deuterium depleted water.
That's about what it.
Yeah, in a perfect world, everybody'd be sucking it down so that we could get our bodies back to the levels, the deuterium levels that they should be at. But it's too pricey, and is there a lot of it in supplements? Yeah, there may be, but you're still better off taking the supplements in my assessment. And in the keto diet where you'd think you might get away from that, no, all those cows, they drank water. Where did that water come from? Places like, I don't know, Earth, where we have high deuterium levels now.
Exactly. I know. I was working with this doctor and I was like, should I, for fertility trying to get pregnant? And I was like, should I do the water, deuterium depleted water? She's like, no, just do keto and fasting. That's enough. That's deuterium depleted. And I'm like, I kind of don't believe you.
Well, that's
thank goodness I didn't believe her. She was also the one that said my AirPods were not hurting me. So let's just.
I think
bad advice.
I think there's some papers that will clearly and demonstrably show that. Sorry, that's wrong. That's 2 + 2 is not 5. There are times when someone is just effectively wrong. The science is in. We actually have done enough research and that's just not right.
Right.
Sometimes I feel like the harbinger of doom, because I'll have discussions about like what people need to do biologically. And by the end of it, you can kind of see people are like, like a deer in the headlights where they're like, I've got to do so much stuff. And, 400 or 500 years ago when our environment wasn't completely crazy, you probably wouldn't have to. But now we're bathed in a soup of all kinds of wackadoo chemicals and EMFs. And, you're right by specifying native EMFs. So that's very keen, because one of the things that I worry about for space travel is that every cell in our body has developed literally from the inception of single-celled organisms, for billions of years or hundreds of millions of years, has evolved being exposed to a Schumann resonant cavity.
Yes.
And I have concerns about, space travel when they don't take that into account. I actually developed two things. One was a kind of an endogenous gamma protection for people to take for astronauts. And then the other was gamma shielding for habitats and for spacecraft, because if you move outside of the magnetosphere, which is kind of this nice protective layer around the planet, that protects us from cosmic emissions, the gamma rays just eviscerate your genome, right? So the first, if we have some colony and we don't take that into account, we're hosed. The first generation will be unhealthy. The second generation will make, as I jokingly say, thalidomide babies look like Olympic athletes. Because you can't crack the DNA that much and not have detrimental effects downstream. So yeah, hopefully people take that into account down the road. But
yeah. Well, Dr. Bonnie Hunt, I don't know if you've heard of her. She did this experiment where she put people in this chamber essentially where they were exposed to no EMF, and within just a few hours she had to pull people out because it was clear they were going to die, like their organ systems were shutting down. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating. I heard it's the guy who invented the Magnetico sleep pad, Dr. Bonley, because we just got one of those for my daughter, the Magnetico sleep pads. And he's talked about her experiments in correlation to, you know, our health, that we actually do need the Schumann resonance. We do need the magnet, you know, the native EMF from Earth in order to survive. We can't just zap it all out. You know, it's not all bad.
Well, I think I haven't. I'm actually going to research that when we get off, though. That's really intriguing to me. But it's not shocking, though, because every cell in our entire body has evolved with exposure to that. It's, you know, it's kind of silly. It's kind of like fish saying, there's nothing to this whole ridiculous water thing. I'm sure we'll be fine on shore. You know, I think that's perhaps a little short-sighted. You know, yeah, I agree. I'm going to check that out. Thanks. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I'd love to hear your feedback. Well, cool. I feel like we could probably talk easily another hour, but you, I know, are in your lab and have things that you probably need to do today. So if people want to find you and, you know, learn more about your work and what you do, and maybe even the C60, what's the best way to do that?
They can go to wizardsciences.com, or they can go to Wizard Sciences on Instagram, or they can find me directly it's at Ian Mitchell 1 on Instagram, and that's pretty much the extent of my socials. So awesome. I think I have 5 or 6 posts. So the guys that I work with kind of make fun of me because I'm not, you know, not terribly adept at doing all the postings, and I don't really keep up with it. But, you know, if people reach out to me, I will always get back to them. So it may take a little bit because sometimes I'm inundated, but I do actually respond to everybody who reaches out. So
awesome. Well, I'll make sure to put all that in the show notes. And thanks again for being here today and chatting.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah. So, all right. Well, thanks, Sarah. Have a great rest of the day and a good weekend.
You too.